Welcome to our monthly showcase of some of our technology from Crimson. And this month we have Kieran and Caroline from our modern workplace practice. And Caroline, I believe you're looking to share some of the work that we've done to tackle GDPR problems that clients are feeling the pain of at the moment.
Indeed, we have, yeah. So we've been doing some work with some clients who have, like most of us, personally identifiable information in their SharePoint environment. And we've been looking at the best ways of trying to remove that content after a set period of time to, crucially, avoid GDPR fines. So we're going to take you through what we think is a nice way of managing that. So I'll just set the scene. Scenario is that GDPR regulation has been introduced and it's now been in place for a couple of years. But a lot of our clients are still struggling with the ability to apply retention periods to content, automatically remove that specific content that's got PII data in it. So we know staff are pretty good at storing content in specific folders. The use of metadata and tagging, a little less familiar with things like that. We've also got the Office 365 Security Compliance Center that can apply retention policies to something called labels. These are all fairly new technologies in Office 365. And we've come up with a way of using the security compliance labels along with Power Automate, previously known as Flow, to automatically apply labels, and then the retention policy on those labels will automatically remove that content, all with the aim of avoiding that fine. I think it's up to 10% of annual revenues, is that right?
Yeah, and there have been some very big cases so far.
So to avoid that fine, the toolkit that we've got in place is the Security and Compliance Center with an Office 365. Caroline, you're saying that you start off with policies and then apply the other way around.
So you do the label and then you do a policy that applies that label. So that means you can reuse the same labels in different policies. Part of that label and policy, you can say when you want the data to be deleted, and you can say whether it's when the document was modified, or whether it was when the label was applied, or whether it's when the document was created, which is important for us when we're putting this onto historical data. Because obviously, if we're going from when the document was created, we want that to be the goal rather than when the label was applied.
Mm-hmm.
You ready for your first stupid question?
Yeah.
Let's go for it.
What do we mean by labels? I mean, in what context? How do we see them? How do we use them? Or are you going to get a demo in a while and show us?
I am going to show them, but they actually go on as a column. So it's just metadata on a document in a SharePoint library.
Okay. Okay.
Just to introduce you, Mark. This is Mark for all of you viewing this. This is Mark Cotton from our Dynamics 365 practice. We've also got, I think, Steve Banner from our Azure practice.
Yes.
Good afternoon. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. So do feel free to ask questions, and Andy too. Andy Cox from support. Thank you, Andy.
Yeah. Even stupid ones.
Live in England, I am. All right.
It's worth adding. I think the reason that we're bringing in consultants from across the business is because increasingly with these Microsoft tool sets, they're speaking to one another. It has implications for other systems. They're talking to one another. So I think it gives us a well-rounded view of how some of this has implications elsewhere, doesn't it?
Completely.
Mm-hmm.
So next up we have Power Automate, which is the glue effectively between the Security Compliance Center and SharePoint or Teams.
Yeah, and I thought it was important that we mentioned that this is Teams, because a lot of people are now working in Teams, and really we know behind the scenes they're working in SharePoint. The thing with this is in SharePoint we're used to working in libraries and having the control, and we could apply a label to a library and say everything within that library will have this same policy. However, with Teams, actually every time you're creating a channel, you're creating a folder within one library. So you may not want the same retention policy for every channel. So you might have a channel that's a social event, but you might have a channel that's about a project, and they might want different governance policies. So that's why we had to look at this by saying, cut it down to folder level rather than doing it at document level, which we would have normally done in SharePoint.
I think that highlights a big issue that we're talking to a lot of clients at the moment around Teams, and actually governance is a huge factor, isn't it, that we're having to help clients with.
And that was it. I've seen people where what they do is they see the files area, so they just go and apply a retention policy, say 30 days, but then it means every single file that goes into Teams is deleted after 30 days, and that's not necessarily what you want.
Okay.
So we've also showed the folders here as so it might be a root folder that's got PII data in it, or it might be a subfolder that's got personally identifiable information in it, and it will work with either scenario. So in the middle here, Power Automate is that glue that communicates with the labels defined in the security compliance area of Office 365, and it applies those labels to the folders, the documents within those folders for the SharePoint and Teams area. And at the bottom there, you can see a list of libraries to where that policy should be applied. And it's to that list then that you can delegate permission to somebody who doesn't necessarily have Office 365 administrator rights. So it's completely separate permissions.
And just for clarity as well, Power Automate, that name has changed to Power Automate fairly recently, hasn't it?
Yeah.
What was it before?
Flow.
So it's Flow, right? Okay.
Guys, just a question. It's the label itself, and I kind of get that it's something you tag an area with. Is the label a security and compliance feature as opposed to a SharePoint feature then, or a Teams feature? It's
from the Office 365 compliance.
Okay.
I'll show you how we do them.
So in the old SharePoint world, you would use SharePoint information management policies to apply retention. But in the new modern interface and with Office 365 SharePoint Online, what Microsoft are trying to do is to make some of those retention capabilities general across all Office 365 products. So not just SharePoint, but also Exchange, email, and probably in the future, messaging within Teams as well.
So these labels that I've set up, although I've set it up, I had to say exactly where I wanted to use it. So I have only said we only want to use it in SharePoint, but it could be used in email as well, or other places, or specific SharePoint sites.
Thank you.
You can choose.
Okay, let's go and have a look at what we've done so far.
So if I go into our site, I've got a SharePoint site here. It's called Shop Floor, and I have a few document libraries. So the one I'm going to work on is Clients Auto, although I will show you some others. And you'll see there's a column here called Retention Label. And that's actually where, when we apply the label, you'll see the name of the label here. So this is another beauty of you can have different types of labels. And when you create the label, you give a description so the users know what sort of retention policy or which policy in your organisation that relates to. So if I go to our Security and Compliance Centre, I'll just show you. In here, we've got lots of different sections. The section that I'm in is the classification, but you can see we've got DLP. You can also get to this from information governance. But we've got sensitivity labels and retention labels. And I've got various retention labels that I've set up here. And you can see I've got auto delete 1 day delete temp. So they're all sort of in a P11. In the real world, we'd hopefully name them slightly better. But in our trial, I wanted things to auto delete in 1 day so I could prove that my tests were working. I could create a new label, but if I just go into the one that we've got, I can show you, it tells us we have a name. And then it tells me I've got a bit of a description. I was telling myself I'm using the second radio button, so I knew which one I was doing. But we have a description for admins and a description for users, which is quite nice. So you techie guys, they get that, and then the users, you can put this relates to our certain policy within our procedures. And then we've got the retention, and it tells you there what it's based on. So as I say, you could do, I've done this based on when it was created, could do it based on modified or based on when the label is applied. The importance of this is there is another section where we can go and we can review the document. If we want to go through a review procedure, then that's where we would need to have an E5, but all this will work with E3.
Right.
So
Yeah, just to add a little bit more information to that. So with the E5 license, it is possible to auto apply labels. So for example, if you had a label that specifically for personally identifiable information, you could search on information within your libraries that might have email addresses or
credit card information, national insurance numbers,
exactly,
things
NI
like
numbers, yeah, spot on. And it would then automatically apply that label to those documents that fulfill that criteria. So had NI numbers or email addresses in them, and then this retention period that you see here, 1 day, 20 days, etc., would then apply to those documents that had that label applied. But the E5 license, there is a cost, extra cost to that, and what we've done here, you don't need the E5 license, it's just the E3 or even license. I don't think you probably need the E3 license actually.
Yeah.
So
what we needed to do was we wanted to apply this, and there were a few scenarios that we came up with, and the one was applying it to information that's already there, and then the other is going forward, how do we do it? So I've got one here that's a manual apply the labels, which I'll go through and show you how it works, because it's the much shorter version. But just so you know, we have also got one that's a scheduled flow. So for at the client that I did this for, we're running it every 2 weeks. And so that means, of course, it's cutting down on how often the flow is running and the cost. Because it was, when we first looked at it, the initial idea was, oh, well, every time someone uploads a document, we'll run the flow and see whether we can run the label. But of course, if they're uploading thousands of documents, that's thousands of flows, it's going to cost them a lot of money. So we decided, well, if we run it once a fortnight and we go in on when the document was created, it doesn't matter, the label still gets, obviously if it had to be deleted the next day, we'd have to think about that. So here is our flow. So I'll go in and just edit the flow so I can take you through the steps that we go through. I'm manually triggering this just so I can use it on the demo, but then we go through and we initialize some variables. And the important one for this is where we start to work with the library address. Because when you run flow for SharePoint, every single step, it always asks you to put in the whole path of the site and the library name. And it wants you to put those in. So to get that to be a variable was quite some work, and I had some help with one of my colleagues from the Dynamics team. We worked together and solved this. But the beauty of it is now we've got it as variables. It means that the users, they haven't got to touch the flow. We can just pass the string in. It goes through, and we've got a little section here to get the past time. So if we've scheduled this and we're going to run it for every 2 weeks, there's no point getting every item from a library. We only want things from the last 2 weeks. So it will do a filter, so we get a variable for that. Then it goes and gets the properties. So it's saying we've got the site name and the list name. And we're going to filter by, is it a folder or is it a document? Because if it's a folder, we're not going to apply the label to it. So we can do those sort of things. And then we go through and we have an apply to each. And it will go through and look. And in this scenario, the documents are stored in specific folders. So we just go and say, is that path in that folder? So we could have lots and lots of different names in there. Obviously, you can see mine not very imaginative, but there's just to show that you can do. So it'll look at it, it'll say, is it in this folder or isn't it in this folder? If it isn't, it won't do anything, and if it is, then it will go and it will apply the label for you.
Just another idea as well, actually, just thinking of a way that we could extend this is parameter side, create those folder names as further parameters in a SharePoint list. So again, you won't need to come into the flow to make those changes.
So one of the things we've done, or I've done today, is I've just done an actual list, and I've just put which libraries it is that we want to run this on. And like Kieran just said, there's no reason why we couldn't say that's the site name, these are the libraries. We could have different ones for library names. And this is, so the idea with this is that then anybody can say, well, we want to apply the retention. They haven't got to touch the flow, they haven't got to have compliance. They can just add an item to this list, and then that flow will run once a fortnight because that library's been added into this list. I'm also looking, today I was looking at actually when you create a library, that will also, you can trigger a flow. So it was like, do we even go one step further? So when someone creates a new document library, do we ask them, does this need to have a retention policy applied? And then it would go into the right list.
I suppose
So to really build this up, we wanted to.
Thinking about governance again, I mean, you, as you're building this automation, you've got to have governance over the automation because it's again, you've got to be very organised. But
good point,
it's so powerful, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, one of the things that we often see with clients is that they might have used Flow, but they've created the flow with a specific user account. And one of the things that we recommend is to use a service account that's shared, or if you're not doing that, at least share the flow with your colleagues so that they can see and access the flow in case you're off, ill, or maybe you've left the company. Nobody else will then have access to that flow to then make changes.
Yeah.
So for those of you that haven't seen Flow as well, I thought I'd actually run the Flow. So there's a couple of nice things in Flow. As you see, it's all these different steps. And what I've done is I've manually put in the address of our document library just for the purpose of this. I've got, there's a nice button there for Flow Checker that will tell me if I've got any errors in my flow, which is nice. And also if you try and save a flow and it's got errors, it tells you. So for people like myself that aren't that good at code, this is a nice way of being able to do it. And by running a test, I can go through and I can start that trigger. So we know this is scheduled to run, but I can run it now. And it will go through and it will show me if my flow has run successfully, and it will show me the stages as it goes through. So you can see I've got these nice green ticks and I can see where my variables are being things. So let's see, it's getting the properties of the files, and I can go through and read this. This is a joy to see. And then I can see it's applied to each. And I can see it's found 28 documents, and each one I can see whether it applied that condition or not. So Flow is really nice for looking at the work that you're doing and seeing when you need to, if something hasn't worked, you can go through and you can see, well, did that meet the conditions? No, that was false. The next one, true.
And how long would something like this take to set up for somebody like yourself, Carol?
Well, now it's
there's quite a lot of investment that's gone into doing this, because there's a clever little bit there that we didn't show at the end, which is the bit that communicates with the Security Compliance Centre and takes the labels and applies them to the folders. So to put this in place at a client, it's really just it's hours worth of effort, but we put a lot of work to get to this stage. That's correct.
So you can see here now, because I've just run that flow, if I go, I've got client A, client's auto, and if I go to the folder, client A, you can see I've got some documents. I've got a document there that's at the root, so it's not in my TWD file or my temporary working documents, so therefore no retention label has been applied to it. But if I go to my TWD folder, and
which is where you have your PII data, your personally identifiable information,
then you can see everything's now got this auto delete retention label applied to it. Now that column is visible, but again, it depends what you want to do. You might not want that visible to your users. So you don't have to show that column if you don't want to. I've added that column so it's visible so people can see that. Whether it's visible or not, it will still run in the background. So if we were to come back to this tomorrow, those documents will have been deleted.
Right.
Is it possible to change that retention label if it's mass added and there's a document that's not relevant there as a user? Could I go in and say, I wish to remove the retention label or change it?
Yeah, it's one of the properties on the document. So if I just click, and I can do a few at the same time. If I go into the information, you can see one of my columns is my retention label, and I can go in here and I can see other retention labels that are there.
Or even choosing that at the top.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And can you prevent users from?
Yeah, you have to do that by policy, but yeah, you could do.
So that prevent users from
removing the label.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, comes back to strong governance.
Yeah. Yeah, because obviously you're going to want them on. It's going to have to be the exception to take them off, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is why, and because people are using Teams, it also sort of highlighted why it was important that we could have this flow. So if I show you the team, if I go into Teams, you'll see I've got my shop floor team here, and I've got two channels. I've got one called General and one called Project X. And if I go to the files area, you'll see.
We don't like to talk about Project X.
Right. Yeah, top secret.
Yeah.
So our Project X, you'll see again, I've reused that idea of the TWD and the project. Now I haven't applied, I didn't run the flow on this folder, but I could, so I want to apply it to this team. But what I want to show you is if I go in and say open in SharePoint, my team, you'll see Project X is actually within the documents document library within SharePoint. So if I go back to documents, you'll see that I've got a folder for each of my channels, and I've also got in there one for temporary working documents. So that's why it's important with this flow that I can say, well, I'll apply the flow to documents, but it's going to go through and it's going to look through at the channels. And if there's a channel that's got a folder in there called temporary working documents, well, then in that case, I'm going to go in and I'm going to apply a retention label to it. Because we know a lot of people now won't be working in the SharePoint area, they'll be working in Teams, and they'll be happily going and creating a channel and working in the files area, thinking almost like it's a separate document library, but actually it's not, it's within documents.
So you've seen people, haven't you, Caroline, where they've applied a retention policy to a blanket library, which might just be a bit of an overkill, and there's that lack of flexibility to specifically identify particular folders that might only have PII data there. One
of the things we've got when we set up a document library is we can say by default every single document in this library will have this retention. And therefore you wouldn't need the flow, you wouldn't do that, and that's brilliant, and it will work if for specific document libraries. But when we're talking about that with Teams, then we need to think a little bit out of the box and how we can work in there with different folders.
And I assume with something like this, is it fairly easy to alert the owner of that document that their document's about to be deleted?
For that's when you need the E5 at the moment. Unless, of course, we would have to build something into our flow. But never say never.
Yeah.
Okay, taking up on that, actually, we've done the reverse. So rather than delete stuff automatically using flow, we've also created new folders using a flow. So at the point that somebody creates, for example, a client document or a client folder, and some of our customers want a specific structure underneath that client folder that might contain other subfolders for contract documents, project documents relating to that client. So we've created a flow to automatically set up that structure so that it's there ready for the user.
Yeah, in Teams, again, that works perfectly. So you put that flow on documents. Every time they create a new channel, they get their files area with the subfolders already created for them in their team.
Yeah, and I know, well, and this has been a big thing for Crimson as a recruitment business for data retention with GDPR, to the point where we had a dashboard created using Power BI, which would allow people to see what was about to be deleted or what was nearing non-compliance.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's fantastic.
And that was data in Dynamics 365.
Yes,
right.
Yeah.
But equally, you could do the same in SharePoint as well, for example.
The organisation that we did this for did actually, when I was talking to the compliance officer, when they saw that they could do this, they did actually extend how long the documents were kept for, because they were far more confident now. So rather than saying they could only have it for 30 days or 6 months, they said, no, now we know that we can apply the labels and we'll say, let's make it a year and we'll stick to a year.
Yeah, it's far more transparent. So just on the board, on the screen here, we just got some of the what we think are some of the advantages of using this approach. So it can deal with documents that not just the library, but at the folder level. You don't necessarily need to have staff that have access to the administration area of Office 365, you can just give them access to this particular SharePoint list that defines the particular libraries or folders that you want to have PII data in. And we are using out of the box Office 365 tools components. And there isn't really any need, there isn't a need for an E5 license unless you wanted to do some auto application of labels. So hopefully that'll be a useful toolkit for our customers in the future.
Brilliant. Any questions on the line from any of the team?
I wondered about, cost isn't all, but if you're paying every time a flow runs, is it the number of executions, or if there's 1 million documents that it tags, is it how much work it does? Is there a cost model?
It's per flow, so by scheduling the flow, it doesn't matter how many documents, it's the time, it's the cost for that flow.
It's the number of times that flow is run, you're right. So yeah. But
the initial one that I did was every time you added a document, so that would have been very expensive.
How much is it per flow, roughly?
Well, as part of your E3 license, you get a free number of flows to run per month. It's of the order of tens of thousands, I can't remember, but you can purchase extra runs if you need to. Yeah.
Okay, and again, are there ways to limit how users can set up flows as well, so that it's not going to cost lots? Or okay, interesting. Okay, great. I think that wraps it up for this month. Well, please leave comments on our YouTube channel. We're keen to get your feedback, and of course, get in contact with the sales team if anybody's watching this and is interested in learning more about this particular tool, or some of the tools that we've talked about around Office 365. And I know what we're planning to do with these monthly sessions is alternate between modern workplace practice and our Dynamics business apps practice. So we'll be turning our attention to those people next month, and we look forward to seeing you follow our channel over the coming months. Thank you.